Need a sealant to help shield your home from the elements? Introducing Tight Shield, your weatherproof shield against the elements. One of Titebond's newest sealant products, Tight Shield fills gaps up to 2 inches while remaining flexible. It adheres to almost any material and expands and contracts up to 50% of joint size. Plus, it comes in a variety of colors and is paintable. Check out Tight Shield and the rest of Titebond's sealant line at titebond.com. Were the inspectors you spoke to, Mike, did they seem enthusiastic about the idea, lukewarm, or did they think it's a bad idea?
You know, I asked for a raise of hands. How many think putting pressure-treated wood in the ground and building a house on it is a bad idea? And like, I could see contractors are like half and half. Building officials all raise their hand, a bad idea.
Welcome to the Fine Homebuilding Podcast, our weekly discussion of building, remodeling, and design topics aimed at anybody who cares deeply about the craft and science of working on houses. This is Senior Editor Patrick McComb. Today I'm joined by Fine Homebuilding Editorial Advisor Mike Girton.
Hey, Patrick.
Fine Homebuilding Senior Editor Brian Pontalillo.
Hello, everyone.
And our producer, Andres Samaniego.
Hello.
Please email your questions to FHBpodcast at finehomebuilding.com. You can find previous podcasts and check out the show notes at finehomebuilding.com/podcast. Good to see you guys. Thanks for being here this morning.
Yeah, you bet.
Brian, how's your place coming? You had some plans to do some landscape lighting, but I don't know if that was in the short term or right away.
Patrick, I think I asked you about that 2 days ago.
Well, I figured you'd be done by now.
So no, it hasn't happened yet. But we've been having these really great spring days, and so I have been outside working in the landscape, and I've started a trend. I think at least I'm telling my family that I've started a trend, and I'm refusing to look this up because I'm sure it's already a trend. But micro gardens. I've been doing micro gardening. So we have this, exactly, Mike. We have this big property that was, I've described it on this show before. When we bought it, it's almost 2 acres and it was totally cleared. So there's a lot of opportunity to plant things and to create gardens and to plant trees and all this kinds of stuff. And so I've been creating these sort of small gardens in various spots on the property where I'm just planting, maybe one shrub and one flower, or a tree and a rock, or just a really small, sweet little garden. And I think I went to the nursery and I bought a handful of stuff last weekend, and I brought it home, and I've just been getting creative with it. I don't know much about gardening, so this is not information to. That I don't have anything to offer in terms of how I'm doing it and what I'm doing well and what I'm not. Maybe I'm planting, flowers under trees that shouldn't be there, or, putting things in too much sun or not enough shade or whatever. But I'm giving it a go, and it's fun. And right now it all looks very pretty. I'm also sure everything is planted way too close together, but man, whatever. I'll move it next year, right?
And doing stuff is a great way to learn about it, right? It's yeah. You got to do it.
Yeah. So micro gardening. Look for the micro gardening book in 2025.
From Fine Gardening.
You better get that hashtag like right now. That's all I can say.
Well, I told Sam, my son, I said, Sam, it's a viral trend. And he said, it is? And I said, yeah, it's a viral trend in my mind. Because I can't stop thinking about it.
Well, Carol's a great resource. I hope you'll ask her if you have specific questions. And otherwise, I hope you'll just have fun doing it. Yeah.
Do you have a master plan that all of this will tie together at some point? Or are these just on a whim, just finding a spot and saying, well, this tree can go here and flower there?
A little bit of both, Mike. There are some areas where I want to kind of make the space on the property a little bit more intimate. So, for example, we have a deck in the back off of our bedroom, and I want that to feel, even though we really are not exposed to the neighborhood back there, I just want it to feel a little bit more private. So I've planted some some bigger, like shrubby kind of things closer to that, so that as they grow up, that space feels a little bit more private. But I've also just stuck a couple of, little micro gardens here and there where, it'd just be something that you'll come upon on the property.
Yeah. Awesome. Andres, what have you been working on? You've been back for a little bit now, and I'm guessing that projects have resumed around your homestead.
Not yet, actually. I'm still catching up on a lot of work, and I haven't been able to do anything but just inspect around the house to see which parts I need to seal for those water leaks that I found on the roof and stuff. So I'm just gearing up.
Well, if you need to borrow a ladder, I can help you out.
Definitely.
Mike, what have you been doing? You been busy?
Yeah, I spent last week putting together a training. It was a several-hour training for the Building Officials Association here in Rhode Island. They have maybe 30% of the building inspectors and officials in Rhode Island come to the day, and I'd say quite a few of the contractors. They invite contractors and local career tech students. So we had maybe 80 to 100 people in the room, and I talked. One of them was about permanent wood foundations, which we'll have a question about that today. So it was timely there because I did a lot of research on putting that presentation together. And what was surprising was after I was done with the presentation, several contractors and a building official came up and said, I came today just to hear you talk about these permanent wood foundations because I'm considering using them. I heard about them and didn't know anything. When they saw it come up on their, in an email notice, they were like intrigued by it. So that was interesting because over the last year or so, we've gotten a couple of questions about pressure treated wood foundations. So yeah, maybe it is another trend, maybe another micro trend. Who knows?
Well, I gotta believe the interest in reducing the carbon inputs in our home building makes these things more attractive to folks who are trying to not use concrete for the aforementioned reason.
Well, one builder who came, and he's a former Fine Homebuilding author, Steve Demetric, he came because he pointed out that 4 of the local concrete forms companies that worked in the area where he worked all retired in the last 18 months. And nobody took over the business and they just closed up. And so he's having a hard time finding forms companies on a timely basis. So he was looking at the permanent wood foundations as a means for him to have his crew, mostly carpenters, be able to do the foundations in addition to the framing and all of the siding and so on the homes they build.
Were the inspectors you spoke to, Mike, did they seem enthusiastic about the idea, lukewarm, or did they think it's a bad idea?
I asked for a raise of hands. How many think putting pressure treated wood in the ground and building a house on is a good idea? Is a bad idea? And I could see contractors are like half and half. Building officials all raise their hand. Bad idea. But I asked at the end, how many building inspectors and officials here would reject a permit application if somebody was going to be building on a permanent wood foundation? Nobody raised a hand. So, I mean, they're amenable to it from a code standpoint. They got to kind of accept it because it's in the code. But I think they're mostly older, old timers, and they're a little conservative in that regard.
Hey, Mike, related to Steve's reason for being interested in permanent wood foundations, the idea that that he and his crew could build them without concrete contractor. I'm curious. You've done permanent wood foundations. You've also done ICF foundations, and I've heard that sort of reasoning around both of them. That the builder can do it and doesn't need a specialty form contractor to do it. So do you have any thoughts on which one, if you were like, is one of them really feel more friendly to, let's say a building crew that's great with carpentry, good with framing, that type of thing. Do you have any thoughts on that? Which one you would steer people towards?
I think for people with mainly a carpentry background, they're probably going to be a little, the permanent wood foundations would be a little easier for them to build and work on because it's framing walls.
It's familiar.
Yeah, it's framing.
Yeah.
And with the foam blocks, the ICFs, I've done them. I've done quite a few of them. The challenge I find most builders have and what scares them the most is placing the concrete in the forms.
Mm.
And then what
Blowouts,
happens if they
right?
blow
Yeah.
out? Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And then how do you straighten those walls when now you've got them braced and you got to straighten them with the concrete in them, and how do you shift them around? And, I have found it pretty easy, but it's that fear of doing the first one, I think, is what
Yeah.
most of them are concerned about. I think after somebody has experience on one or two, then they're like, no big deal. We can do this day in and day out if we wanted. So
Right.
once you get over that learning curve, which isn't that hard, you're all set.
Yeah.
Well, I want to introduce a new thing to the podcast that I hope to do with some regularity, calendar of events. This is a good way for y'all to learn about important things in the high performance home building world. First off, in Boston, September 10th and 11th, we have another building science symposium. And similarly in Chicago in October, the 8th and 9th, similar to the lineup we've had in years past that you've heard about. I hope you all will check that out and sign up, because all of the proceeds go to benefit Keep Craft Alive and other organizations that are meant to foster involvement in trade work. So please do that. It's a good thing to do. I also want to point out a really cool piece on GBA written by our friend Justin Fink, who talks about using linseed oil paint in his recreation and restoration of historical windows. And, it's very unusual in my life, having done this for 20, 30 years, depending on when you start counting, about something I've never heard about. And this paint is something I was completely unfamiliar with. It has a number of benefits, according to Justin, and he offers sources of supply. So I think that is entirely worth checking it out. Were you impressed or intrigued by this feature, Brian?
I thought it was great. In fact, we were developing that feature both for GBA and Fine Homebuilding. We're gonna add a little bit to it for the magazine. GBA, publishes things much quicker than we do in the magazine, so we didn't have time to get a sort of a step by step together for GBA. But I think we're going to try to get that together for the magazine, just to give a little bit more detail on actually painting with linseed oil paint. I just think these are the kinds that, it's certainly a niche product, but it's also for the right person in the right project, it's a great product. And so, Justin did just such a good job researching this article, and I guess because he's also been researching it for his own work. So, I think it's excellent. I check it out on GBA and look for it in the magazine in coming months.
I also want to remind you all about this is the yard sale and flea market time of year, and I took advantage of a little shopping this weekend with Karl, and I bought some amazing stuff. One of the most interesting places was a yard sale on the way to the big flea market in Stormville, New York, and this family had a bunch of stuff out. Apparently, the grandfather, the patriarch of the family, had a what I would describe as a commercial door hardware enterprise, and there were closers and ball bearing hinges and kick plates and giant pools and all this amazing stuff. I try not to buy stuff at yard sales or flea markets to invent projects, but boy, I gotta tell you, there was quite a temptation to just buy a bunch of stuff here because it was so cool and well priced.
It looks like you got a bunch of stuff according to the photograph.
Yeah, including the 14-inch pipe wrench for $20, which I got at the Connecticut Antique Machinery Museum Spring Power Up, which is another annual tradition I look forward to. So, if you all have any yard sales, tell us about them in the podcast email box. And we'll spend some money there. This comes from Vic. He shares a newspaper article. He says, unfortunately, no air sealing details in this news article. The housing market has been tough, but in D.C.'s Shaw neighborhood, one home may be someone's chance to get into a brand new single-family home, but there's a catch. It's only 6 feet wide. The builder said the original idea was supposed to be a 4-level single-family home. Then after work had begun, he said the city threw him a new challenge, approving a structure that was 6 feet wide, which is essentially the width of a driveway. And I don't even think that's true. Aren't driveways like 8 or 10 feet? Yeah. So it's
It's a
Did you guys
sidewalk.
see this house? It's a
Yeah.
sidewalk.
Yeah, I saw the house. It's striking when you see something that narrow. Looks narrower than a shed.
I'm delighted by constraints in design because I often think it helps you come up with interesting solutions, and I got to think this is the case here. What do you think about this place, Brian, Andres?
Well, I mean, I when I was, when I first read the email, I was skeptical, as you would be, and then when I went and looked at the photos, I thought, wow, it's a really good looking house on the outside. Even though it's such an odd shape, the proportions are nice, and I mean, they got a deck into this project. I mean, it's amazing. They have a deck on a 6 foot wide 6 foot wide house. I love the fact that they didn't. They made it work in this narrow lot, and they didn't skimp on finishes, and it's nice looking. It looks comfortable to live in. I'm really impressed.
So I was wondering how they were going to arrange the bedroom, because you figure out
Yeah.
I'm 6
Yeah.
feet tall, and if it's only 6 feet wide, and 6 feet wide is the exterior, right? So the interior is going to be a little narrower than that. But just like for folks who are familiar with motorhomes and camping trailers, they have slide outs or bump outs. They put a bump
Yeah.
out there of looks like about 16 or 18 inches, which I guess gave them enough width so that they could put a queen size bed running perpendicular to the length of the building, so that somebody tall could still fit in and sleep in the house. It was a little wider in that area than just 6
Yeah.
feet. Yeah,
And
which is good, creative.
It's creative. And looking at that photo, Mike, of the bedroom, it even looks like there's a comfortable amount of space to walk
Yeah.
around, the bed and get to the closet, which is on the far side of it. So yeah, I was really blown away by this project.
You tempted Andres to move the DC into a 6 foot wide house. What do you think?
I've seen worse actually in my country. They have these very tight spaces, and they still build these high up, houses and buildings. But looking at this, it kind of reminds me, as Mike said, like a mobile home. It has the same amount of space, more or less, but it's very
Yeah,
comfortable.
I think they did a great job. And if y'all see other examples of good house design, please send those along. I would be grateful to see more of that stuff. That was really cool. This comes from Kathryn. Dear FHB podcast, I listened with interest to the question about the cost implications of a heat pump hot water heater for Luray, Virginia. As it turns out, Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, Rocky Mountain Institute, and other partners just released the Green Upgrade Calculator, so you can figure out lifetime costs and lifetime emissions of various energy upgrades. When I plugged in that zip code footprint, I could compare a new resistance water heater tanked with a new heat pump water heater also tanked. Looking at just the cost, the break-even point is about 3 years, though obviously mileage will vary depending on how much hot water you're using and if you have demand response with your utility, etc. The upfront costs always seem really important when making a purchase, but for things like water heaters, they're dwarfed by the yearly operating costs. In this case, the annual costs were lowered by $311 per year. Insert usual caveats here. Anyway, I thought you might enjoy playing with this tool. It doesn't get into the weeds too much, so I think it will be very helpful for people who don't want to spend too much time agonizing over a decision. We'll put a link to the RMI Green Upgrade Calculator on the podcast webpage. Mike, you had a chance to play around with this, I understand?
Yeah, I played around with it a little bit, the calculator. It's a little, I won't say wonky, but it asks you a bunch of questions before it'll give you the answer, which are superfluous to what you really want to know. Like in this case here, where Kathryn wanted to know what the difference was in the cost, both upfront cost and return on investment, payback period, that kind of stuff, for the heat pump water heater versus a conventional electric resistance water heater. But there were a bunch of other pages you kind of had to get through. But when it does generate the information, it's even that isn't entirely clear because it presents it in a graph form. So you have to hover over the graph to actually see where the lines cross. With the heat pump water heater, upfront cost is higher, so it's got a lower slope to that line versus the electric resistance when its upfront cost is lower, but the annual cost to operate is higher. So you really got to zero in to find out where that sweet spot is of how many years it is before you break even. But yeah, it is handy. I think I'd like to see another calculator which was a little more user friendly, who just wanted the basic information, and then just give it to you in dollars and cents rather than on a plotted graph.
I would point out that this stuff is often evolutionary, and later iterations often get better. So.
Yeah, and when they have to take into consideration, they're trying to make a calculator for everyone and everywhere, and that's hard, because there are calculators called energy modeling software that you can hire an energy modeler to use on your specific project in your specific region with all these details about your house that will give you actual answers to these questions. But that requires, going down that path. So, requires an expert and more detail and all that.
And probably $1,500 or $2,000, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and money. Yeah.
Yeah, and with that point made, yeah, you're right. This is a pretty simple one, and you can work your way through it. It might take a couple of tries to get it to quit giving you error messages in that you didn't fill out all of the required information, but once you do, it'll work.
Yeah, and they're often helpful in their relativity. At least, even if they're not going to get you to real numbers for your project, they might show you a relative comparison that's accurate between two things. Like a heat pump versus standard electric water heater.
Well, I want to point out that Kathryn's email is super timely because we just learned that the Department of Energy has revised the standards for electric water heaters. Brian, you've looked into this. Can you summarize what's going to change, please?
Yeah, I've looked into it enough to sort of introduce the topic. So I believe that this new standard is the press release said it was congressionally mandated. So I think it relates to some of the provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act that revolve around energy efficiency and upgrading standards for all different sorts of appliances. It does apply, what we're talking about here applies specifically to electric water heaters and common-sized electric water heaters. And I think that caveat is because often there are exclusions for when the federal government or the Department of Energy does stuff like this, there often are exclusions for products that are specialty products, or just it's going to be impossible to meet their standard with. There are also some efficiency standard improvements to gas and oil fired water heaters, but they're separate from this. It's not an apples to apples comparison. So the new rules, which start in 2029, if I'm remembering that right, have an efficiency increase that is going to require most common-sized electric water heaters to utilize heat pumps to meet it. So I think what's happening here is similar to what happened with incandescent light bulbs. We like to say that the government outlawed incandescent light bulbs, but that's not true. The government created an efficiency standard for light bulbs that incandescent light bulbs will never meet, and therefore manufacturers had to move to other types of other technologies. I think that's what's happening with water heaters. The efficiency standard is going to such a degree that manufacturers will have difficulty meeting it in an electric appliance without using a heat pump.
I mentioned this to Carol this morning and told her that I was considering stockpiling resistance water heaters in the basement for later resale. I think I'm going to corner the market.
But isn't the whole idea behind increasing the efficiency requirements is that then there would be more incentive to the manufacturers to make more of them, and usually when you make more of them, the price comes down. So Patrick, it might work. You might be on the short end of short selling in that regard.
No one ever accused me of being a wise investor, Mike. Anna writes in, the discussion about different water/leak flow monitors mentioned the Moen Flow by name and referenced other brands as well. The DIY ability of those monitors was also joked about, as in not so much. I use and love a different water monitor that was not mentioned. It is called the Flume, and it is DIY friendly. It's available for $250 on the company website and on Amazon. It's a two-part item, a battery-powered monitor that snugs up to the side of the meter in the box, and a plug-in receiver on the house Wi-Fi. I have Flumes on 3 different rentals for which I pay the utilities, and I've gotten alerts for running toilets, dripping kitchen sinks, and the Flume identified a small main line leak between the meter and the house that was losing 25 gallons a day. Flume data also supported my argument that a sudden $1,000 water bill was a meter, not a leak or running toilet. Now, Flume doesn't cut into any water lines and doesn't shut anything off, but it's so easy to install. The app is easy to use and interpret, and you can get minute-by-minute data on water use. I heartily recommend it. Cheers, Anna. Anna reminds us that she was a question asker in episode 607. Well, thanks for that, Anna. I am intrigued. I want to know how the heck it works without drilling into the pipe, but do you guys have a theory on how that works?
Well, I wrote about these materials a while back, or these products, water leak detectors, a while back, and this one was mysterious. It's in a way like smart thermostats. This company is not coming from a like many smart thermostats. This company is not coming from a plumbing background. They're coming from a technology background. It's a tech startup,
Cool.
And they say that it uses electromagnetic. It reads the electromagnetic waves.
That sounds like those fuel economy devices I used to see in Popular Mechanics in the 80s.
Right, coming from the water meter. But the fascinating thing is that they say I had it in front of me. Here it is. They say that it can detect usage down to 1/100th of a gallon, which is enough to detect a dripping faucet or a leak or a leaking outdoor sprinkler. So they claim this real high level of accuracy. So. Yeah, it's an interesting product for sure because, you can really just order it. It straps right onto your plumbing.
How much, Brian? Do you have it listed up there? Do you?
Let me see if I have the price.
So I gotta briefly say I recently ran our well dry because the toilet was running, and gosh, that's a pain. It takes a long time to recover. I got a bunch of sediment in the filter. You can't do laundry in our case for a couple days without worrying that it's going to go dry again. So yeah, it's a hassle. At a minimum, it's a hassle.
$250. And when I wrote about it, I don't know if this is still true, but when I wrote about it, there was a basic package, $250 for the product and the app, and you can start using it. But then there was an upgrade to a subscription. I think that maybe they monitored your plumbing for you, or added some sort of product enhancements with a subscription to the software.
Well, I was intrigued until then, but yeah. Thanks, Anna. I think that's worth knowing about, especially for folks who don't want to have to do plumbing work, right? If you could put this on without a plumber, that would be pretty cool.
Yeah, and there are also there's also systems where you just put these little sensors underneath your sink and underneath your laundry, and they just literally sit on the floor and wait to detect water dripping on them, and then they can just sound an alarm in your house. I mean, there's really sort of some simple versions of water leak detectors if you don't want to install something in your plumbing system.
Plumbing leaks are a huge source of insurance claims. I'm wondering when the insurance business is going to make us put some similar technology in our houses, because I'm guessing it would be less expensive for them to provide this stuff to the tune of $200 or $300 than it would be to pay even the smallest claims related to a leak or a ruptured pipe.
I wonder if the insurance industry would approach it from a incentive to get us, we'll give you a lower rate if you install this, or if they'll go like they do sometimes and approach the ICC and have some requirement put into the building code, which then impacts them in that it would, whether it's earthquake resistance, wind resistance for roof shingles, for instance, that they support when the codes are changed every couple of years. There's a couple of ways that the insurance company can take a swing at encouraging people to, or requiring people to put these in.
Yeah, I looked at insurance claims. This might be a little dated info, but within 5 years, and the average water issue, the average insurance claim relating to a water issue was $10,000. So it's big. It's big money just for like that's your average claim.
And the disruption to your life. Wouldn't it be great to have your phone tell you that you had this leak and have someone go shut the water off in your house before it like turns into a major disaster while you're away?
Major disaster and a major bill. As Anna points out, that this flume information she could use to support her argument that her water bill was $1,000 more than it should have been. So
Right.
even the water company must recognize that these devices are more accurate than their meters that are reading how much water we consume.
Well, if y'all have experience with this technology, I'd love to hear about it. Our first question comes from Chris. Hey, podcast team. I'm a self-employed carpenter located in northern Vermont, but I began my career on the coast of southern Rhode Island. Being a one-man show, I built homes with various crews and general contractors and was fortunate to see a lot of different methods and materials for different aspects of construction. I always took a little piece of all of them that made the most sense to me and tried to do things with all of those different experiences in mind to get the best result. Windows were one of the things it seemed everyone had a different take on and pet peeves about how they were installed. Copper pans, clapboard with a tape product, tape the bottom flange, don't tape the bottom flange, flap the WRB over the top, just use tape. Everyone had something about it they were set on and they didn't want to do it any other way. One rainy, windy day on Watch Hill, I stood in front of a window and watched as the building sucked air and water under an untaped bottom flange, and I thought to myself, wow, the house is a vacuum under a heavy wind. It was then and there I decided I'd barricade the water at the face of the window, making sure no water could ever get in from outside unless the window itself failed, and that meant taping everything off, flashing it all down. This was probably 10 years ago, and now I'm no longer on the coast of Rhode Island, but instead, now I'm on Lake Champlain. I had a window install job last summer at a house on the lake, and I thought, well, I'm just the guy for this job because I know what to do to keep wind-driven rain out of the window opening. Well, as it turns out, switching climate zones and working on existing homes is much different than new construction somewhere a little further south. I learned that water outside doesn't try as hard to get in the window opening as the water inside does, as vapor. The client noticed a small stain on the corner of her pine extension jamb and sent me a picture asking about it. I said I'd take a look at it and see if there was an issue. What I found was that when I removed the interior trim and the spray foam at the bottom of the window, the cedar shims on top of the zip tape sill on the top of the clapboard had soaked up water that was sitting at the flange with nowhere else to go. It traveled to the interior using the shim as a wicking highway, and the extension jamb had wicked it up the shim just enough to make a stain. I came to find out the old windows in that room used to do the same thing. The room is an old porch that's been converted. It's spray foam with no heat register. It seems to me that humidity is gathering in that room and getting into the places where it can find a cold condensing surface. There are big overhangs and a well-detailed tape job. It tells me it's absolutely not coming from outside. My solution is going to remove the siding and trim the outside, inspect the flashing to make sure nothing has changed, get that bottom flange opened up and flashed out, replace the cedar shims I had with plastic ones, and refoam the bottom. Finally, I'll seek a tape around the window to air seal from the inside instead of just relying on the foam. I don't have many resources up here as I've not been able to meet new builders or carpenters since I moved. I'm just wondering if you guys would have anything to add. I love the podcast. Thanks for reading. I've attached some photos so you can see what's going on. The bottom photo is the back side of the flange from the inside. Thanks again, Chris. Well, Chris, thanks for the thorough email. Mike, I think you're a resident window flashing and detailing expert. What do you think about Chris's question?
Well, I ticked off 5 different subtopics that could easily fill the rest of this podcast, and then maybe another one. Working on crews that employ different approaches and their different window installation and flashing techniques, because just as Chris points out, everybody has their favorite way, and there's lots of ways to do it right, and even any one of those, you do a little part of it wrong, and you've got a problem. Then the generalizations about climate zone impacts and building practices. A lot of people think, oh, if I'm building in this zone, it's different than that zone. But a lot of things end up translating between different zones because it's
Mm.
just good practice no matter where you go. The moisture vapor and how it moves in and around windows, the perimeter of a window, depending on how you put in the insulation and or air sealing around the window. And then the window flashing, issues and sealing them. And then, I have a few comments on what his approach is going to be here, and what his general approach is. So, I mean, do you want to spend the rest of the
Go for it.
podcast
Well,
on?
we gotta keep it a little brief, but
Yeah. So, it, I think just like Chris experienced in South County, Rhode Island, where he worked on a bunch of crews and everybody had their own way of doing things. I'll bet, even though he hasn't clicked in with contractors up in the northern Vermont area, I'll bet he'll find the exact same thing. He'll find everybody has their own approach and they all like different ways of doing things, and that no one is right. Every house is really unique, and it's hard to make generalizations based on climate zone. And I think, as he pointed out, that this porch, there's a humidity problem in the porch, and that the converted porch, that enclosed area, the room he's putting the windows in on, and that's probably the source of the moisture, as he's probably rightly pointing out. It's probably the moisture, humidity in the room. But there are two ways for that moisture to move. It can move by diffusion, which is a very slow mechanism to get into and back to the flange and condense, either in the sill pan that he put there or in that cavity. Or it's probably more likely that there's some air leaks. Even though Chris used spray foam around the window, spray foam isn't magic. It doesn't like automatically figure out every little spot that it has to seal up when you spray it in. A lot of contractors will just spray the whole cavity between the backside of the flange and the inside drywall face, that whole, whatever it is, 3.5 to 5.5 inches, depending on the framing and the width of the gap. And sometimes if those gaps are widthwise very small, like 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch or smaller, the foam doesn't penetrate really well into there and spread out. So foam isn't always a cure-all. It's not magic. So my guess is that there was probably some gaps in that spray foam that he originally put in that allowed some air to leak. And even though he taped the outside, if he taped from the flange to the house wrap, air can move between the house wrap and the wall sheathing. So that isn't necessarily on the outside a great air seal. So I think what Chris's approach now with putting the foam in may not be totally necessary. I think that the tape on the inside is going to be the air barrier that's going to help there. And what I would recommend is using like a stone wool or a mineral wool as your insulation between the back of the flange, because it's less moisture sensitive. It's going to let moisture drain down into a sill pan. Now, hopefully, Chris has either a sloped or a back dam sill pan down there. And because it's going to open up and not seal the bottom flange of the window on this reinstall as he did on his previously what he did was he sealed that bottom flange to the wall. Now he's going to enable it so the water can drain to the outside, which is a good thing if it does condense in that cavity. And then that insulation on the sides, if it's stone wool or rock wool, lets the water drain down if it condenses and then move out. But ideally, if you block the air from getting out to and into that cavity, you won't have the condensation to begin with. So I would skip the spray foam and use just the tape and then some drainable, less moisture problematic, sponge-like insulation in that space. Anybody else have any
I
other
just want to
thoughts
say
on
something
that?
briefly, and I'll give Brian a chance to weigh in here. But when you see water running uphill, Chris, that is a bunch of stuff going on, right? And to imagine that, that's going to happen in every win scenario is, I think, not true, because where's the wind coming from? Are there windows open in the house? Are there other things going on that could affect the pressurization differential between inside and outside that is causing that water to go uphill like you observed? So, I mean, when you see something happening once in that regard, I would not take that as a rule, as that's how things are going to behave all the time. And I totally agree with Mike with regard to spray foam and air sealing. More often than not, when you take things apart to see how spray foam is air sealed long term, you'll find that it is separated from the framing. And I don't know what the mechanism that's caused that, but even those little tiny gaps can move a surprising amount of air and lead to the kind of condensation that we've been talking about. What do you think, Brian?
I think Mike, I think you all covered it pretty thoroughly. One thing he didn't mention was whether or not he found whether this area was wet when he found it or not. Because if it was dry, sometimes things get wet and they dry, and it's actually not a problem. So there's also that. Walls all over America are getting wet right now, and not all of them will have major problems. So, of course, do your due diligence as you rebuild this. That's not what I'm not suggesting not to do better, but it may not. A little staining. I mean, we've all opened up old houses that have been wet over and over and over again and have staining, and there's not rot issues and there's not mold issues, because sometimes things get a little wet and they dry.
Especially when you're on the shore of Lake Champlain, right? Like that is a hard environment, and you're going to have wind-driven rain with some regularity.
Yeah.
A couple of things to add. In Chris's situation, the photo that he sent shows the original window frame and an extension jamb on the inside. And when you are doing any air sealing with a window and you're going to be putting on an applied extension jamb, you want the air seal to be at the original frame of the window, not on the extension jamb, because any gaps between the extension jamb and the frame of the window are going to be air leaks. So you might be doing a really good job sealing out the air leak to the extension jamb on the inside face of that extension jamb, at the drywall level, but there might be air leaking in further into that cavity. The high pressure wind skirt is a good way to deal with that wind driven rain. As you mentioned, Patrick, when you're considering when the wind driven rain, if it may not always be going uphill, but if it does, going up behind the flange, your first thought is, well, we'll tape over or seal that bottom flange, but that can be problematic if you've got a sill pan flashing. It's not going to drain. And I was looking at one major window manufacturer's installation guide last night just to see how they approached the barrier system, which is the system where you actually seal the entire flange around the perimeter, including the bottom, to the wall and then tape it. And in their instructions, it shows first putting in a sill pan and then sealing the bottom of it. So it's like head slap. There's a problem there with their approach, because like in the case here that Chris is describing, he had the sill pan and but sealed that bottom flange. So the pan collected the water, but there was nowhere for the water to go except to dry to the inside through the extension jamb and so on. So yeah, a few other things to really think through how these things are going to behave. And experience is a good instructor here. And then the last thing I'll mention is tell the homeowners to put in a dehumidifier in the winter to keep that room a little bit drier, because that would help to reduce the moisture load that might be migrating through the walls where you can't see what's going on. It might be slowly rotting those walls out due to condensation on the air that's getting into the cavities.
I'm going to take this opportunity to make my normal suggestion, which is you need to buy a tool, Chris. You need an IR camera, which is going to help you to see both air leaks and wet surfaces. And I would tell all of you listening that if you don't have one and you have any interest in building diagnostics, it is a awesome tool for figuring out what's going on without taking things apart. So we have a feature coming up in Fine Homebuilding on that subject, written by Randy and Williams, and he is got a a lot of insights having used these things for, more than a decade. So I can't wait for that to come to fruition. We heard from our friend Evan Bachwig, who enjoyed our discussion of footing options in episode 628. He says another listener was asking how to do traditional Japanese footings in an area that gets hard winters. When it comes to protecting a footing, would it be crazy to install some form of hydronic heating system in the soil around the footing to keep it from freezing during the winter? Has something like this been done before, or is it simply too much work and simpler just to drill deeper holes for the footings? Evan, I want to thank you for thinking outside the box. I think that is pretty awesome. And I would say that some of these houses exist unintentionally in Levittown and other places that have slab foundations without insulation under them. But I think it's an energy suck, which is why we don't do this, because, right, the ground has infinite capacity to absorb heat. And if we think to our laws of thermodynamics, it's always going to be moving from more to less. So if you're putting a heat source in near the footing to keep it from freezing, sure, it's going to work, but it's going to take an insane amount of energy to do so, because it's just going to move away from it as it heats up. So what do you guys think? I'm thinking if we have interplanetary building at some point, this might be a requisite. I don't know enough about interstellar geology to say, but it seems like something we should be figuring out.
It's a solution in what's that expression? It's a solution in search of a problem. We know how to do footings that don't need any heating or cooling or ventilation. It's one thing where you don't have to air seal.
We should remind folks that Evan is in Dallas, Texas, so we can forgive him. He's used to cooling and not heating. This comes from Karl. Hello, FHB team. I started listening recently and enjoying the podcast very much. Great work, and thank you. My partner and I recently bought 20 acres in northeast Minnesota, climate zone 3B. For the last couple of years, we've mostly been living in a canvas wall tent on other people's property. But now we have our own land. We like the simplicity of this lifestyle, and we're saving money for our planned house build, which has been a long-time dream of ours. The only thing that we plan on contracting is the site prep, to include scraping topsoil, removing stumps, and bringing in fill material. The rest of the labor will be done by us and our friends and the friends we can get out to help us. Even with all this time saving, and even with all this savings, believe it or not, we aren't rich. Our total budget for this build is $25,000. Yes, you read that right. We have another $20K that we could be used, but we'd rather wait another year and try to save some more money instead of digging into that. All of the money is liquid. The land is in an area where code is not enforced, so we don't have to worry about anyone telling us we can't move in if it's not finished. The plan is to build a shed roof structure with a footprint of 16 by 24. It will be a single room with a 12 by 16 lofted space. The foundation will be a gravel pad with a treated wood foundation. It'll consist of 6 inches of 3/4 inch gravel for the capillary break. There'll be 2 layers of PT 2x12s laid flat around the perimeter as a footing. And there will be 2x4 sleepers in the gravel that will support 2x4x16s laid on edge at 16 inches on center. It will connect the perimeter, acting as floor joists of sorts. In between the floor joists will be 3.5 inches of EPS. We'll lay down a 10 mil vapor barrier over that and install 2 layers of 3/4 inch tug and groove plywood screwed to the sleepers, and that will be our floor system. There will be 2 inches of subsoil XPS extending 4 feet to the outside to make a frost-protected shallow foundation. We're not planning on plumbing or electric. When the time and finances come along, we'll plan on running some simple electric, which includes a couple receptacles, maybe a mini split, via metal conduit on the interior of the walls. We've been tossing around the idea of putting in a rain barrel and plumbing a line just inside for doing dishes and anything where potable water is not necessary. This is not my main question, but if you have thoughts on this, I would be curious to hear them. I'm going to go in on that. If you can get water in any way, it's going to be helpful, right? Even if only to build the house, right? Painting, drywall finishing, all these things need water. And if you have, well, go ahead, Mike, what?
Well, he's putting plywood as the interior finish, so there's no drywall to be finished.
Painting?
Yeah.
Painting. Okay.
Yeah, a little bit.
You're right.
Won't be too
The
much.
plan for the wall assembly is structural plywood sheathing on the inside, which could also be used as a finished wall covering to save costs. There will be no vapor barrier on the inside. There will be 24 on center 2x4 studs, R11 fiberglass bats to fill the stud cavities. Then on the outside of the studs will be 1.5 inches of XPS with horizontal 2x4 purlins running in between the XPS sheets. On the outside of all that will be a house wrap. Then on the house wrap will be rough cut board and batten siding from our local sawmill. The boards will be 1 inches thick by 6 to 12 inches wide. The roof is 2x12 rafters, 16 on center with R38 fiberglass bats, plywood sheathing, ice and water shield, peel and stick, a layer of screen furring strips, corrugated metal roofing, all on a 4/12 pitch. Our heat source will be wood heat, at least until we get a mini split. We're working on ventilation without electricity, but when been told a method that uses a long pipe with many holes in it could be vented to the outside. The idea that as an outside air comes in through the pipe, it will disperse more gradually through the holes, hopefully eliminating a direct cold draft on winter days. This is something we're not married to and are open to other options. Finally, is this doable? What would you change? Where would you focus your time and money? Does the structure as a system sound reasonable? Am I overlooking anything? Any help would be appreciated. Thank you, Karl. What do you guys think of Karl's lengthy plan here? He's building a cabin with 2x4 walls, XPS on the outside, board and batten siding, 2x12 rafters, and a frost-protected shallow foundation, right, Mike? That's the part you were captivated by.
Yep. He could simplify a lot, both the floor assembly and the wall assembly, to make it less materials and less labor and a better performance. So what he's proposing on the floor is to put these 2x4 sleeper joists basically laying down over the crushed stone with some embedded perpendicular 2x, either the double 2x12 foundation footing on the perimeter and then some intermittent 2x4s into the stone. And then he's going to cut the foam to fit between the 2x4. So instead of doing that, eliminate all those pressure treated 2x4 floor joists, put the plastic, 10 mil plastic, right over the stone, put the foam over the top of the plastic, and then put the 2 layers of the tongue and groove subfloor directly on top of the foam and make that the floor. That's been done in a couple of Fine Homebuilding articles as basement finish slabs, and it works just fine. It's been shown in both Steve Demetric and Steve Basic use that on a regular basis as a way to avoid
I think you have one
concrete.
problem with your stack up, Mike, and I learned this because of a piece I worked on with Andy Grace, and that says the vapor barrier should be on top of the foam directly under and that's something I think has changed in my lifetime. But you want the vapor retarder to be as close to the interior as practical, where it won't get damaged. So under the subfloor.
You're right. I'm wrong. Yep, you're right. But still, the idea of eliminating all of that pressure treated framing and then making it continuous, it saves you labor cutting all the foam between the joists and so on. And then on the wall, because Karl has already got a whole bunch of materials like the plywood and some R11 cavity insulation, he's going to go that way. It's going to be 2x4 frame wall. And then he's going to put the foam on the outside, but he's going to put these horizontal 2x4s first and then cut and fit the foam between the horizontal 2x4s. And those horizontal 2x4s are essentially going to be the nail base for the vertical board and batten siding that he's going to put on the outside. So instead of, again, cutting all that foam between those 2x4 horizontal purlins, just cover that whole wall over the studs on the exterior with the foam continuously, tape all the joints, then put a house wrap over that. And then you can put either 2x4s, or if you want to save a little money, put 1x3s horizontally and screw those right through the foam into the studs, and then put your board and battens on over that. It gives you a vented space behind the board and batten, and it also gives you a continuous insulation layer over the studs. So a little bit less labor, maybe saving a little bit on materials. It's just changing the pieces and parts that he's already planning into a slightly different arrangement.
Thoughts, Brian? Seems like a pretty sound way to build this, as Mike describes.
Yeah, well, I was thinking about that wall assembly too, and one of the thoughts that came to mind to me was to not that different than what Mike is saying, but to use a faced rigid foam, tape the seams, make that your WRB, then simply because he's talking about putting WRB over the purlins, but use a foam that can be the WRB, tape the seams, put your purlins up, and then put your siding right over that, and then you've got a nice airspace between the siding and the WRB instead of having the WRB right on the back of the siding. So that's another possibility there. And I think foil face foam with tape seams is, especially for a project like this, is suitable WRB.
Especially
I
when
had a
there's no
question.
code enforcement.
Yeah, yeah.
I had a question about, folks make a big deal about drainage when you have horizontal strapping behind vertical siding, especially. But we've learned that that's really not a concern. Is that right, Mike? Am I oversimplifying that?
No, I think you're right. And Paul Eldrenkamp up in the Eastern Massachusetts area years ago wrote, I don't know if, I think it was in the Journal of Light Construction, JLC. He wrote a short piece about having taken apart an old building. It was 80 years old at the time, and it had horizontal furring, and they put the cedar shingles over it. He was remarking at how well those cedar shingles had lasted. They would have never removed them, except that they were putting an addition onto
Hmm.
the side of the house. So they removed them, and he said that obviously there's a little bit of moisture moving in just because it absorbs through the wood siding, but it just kind of dries and everything moves. Everything dries by diffusion or capillary action, and it's not an issue. But it did improve remarkably the lifespan of those shingles being over those horizontal furrings. So yeah, I think that horizontal wouldn't be is just as good without having those vented channels like we ordinarily see with a rain screen, where you get the intake vent down low, the vertical channels, and then the exhaust vent up at the top. Same
And you
thing.
could put
Think
that
about
arrows on there for your neighbors so
yeah,
they
the
know how
smart
it's
arrows.
working, right? You can
And you
demonstrate.
can think about the brick veneer and stone veneer siding done the same way. We have to have the 1-inch airspace back there, but we have these tiny little weep holes at the bottom, and we have no real effective vent at the top, yet those cavities perform very well in letting the moisture, maybe it moves in and then it moves out.
What about the wood foundation? Like you mentioned, Mike, this comes up a lot in podcast conversation. Is our audience unusually interested in wood foundations, or do you think this is something that's finally getting traction here?
I think it's our audience is thinking beyond where most builders and homeowners do. I think they're just, maybe heard about it either in an earlier podcast or saw it somewhere online and thought, huh, that's an interesting idea. Let's explore that. In the case of where Karl's probably going to be building, both he wants it to be cost effective, do a lot of the labor himself. There probably isn't a concrete batching plant nearby where he would be anyway. And this is a structure where if he did a lot of screwing together, he could disassemble this whole structure and maybe reutilize the materials on his more permanent home that he might build in the future. So it's a kind of adaptable in that regard, rather than having placed a chunk of concrete on the ground where you're kind of fixed in that spot. You're not going to move it. I did in the show notes will be some an installation guide. If Karl's interested in looking at it's from the Home Innovation Lab, the NAHB lab. It's about it's about frost protected shallow foundations, which is essentially what he's doing here, and a detail that I found on GBA, and it's in uh, we'll have the thread there. And if you go down to one of the comments, I think it's comment number 25, and it'll have an illustration of a similar but slightly different take on what Karl's talking about for the permanent wood shallow frost protected foundation. The one thing that Karl does have in his illustration that I think he could completely skip is he has a 6-inch drain in the perimeter outside of the building, like a perimeter drain, which is about probably 8 or 10 inches below the top of his floor system. And that really wouldn't be necessary because you don't really need footing drains on a slab on grade house. It's sort of, why bother, because the grade is going to handle all the moisture anyway, as long as you have the earth sloped away from your building.
Well, I hope you'll keep us apprised of your build, Karl. I think this is awesome, and I love that you are going to do most of this yourself out in the woods. It's a dream of mine. Sounds awesome. Go ahead,
One
Mike.
thing I just want to note, Karl identified his climate zone as 3B in northeastern Minnesota. Karl, I think you're in climate zone 7A. I looked at the maps, because 3B, you're going to be
Is
like down
Carolinas, right?
well, 3B is going to be a dry zone, so it'd actually be like in West Texas or like New Mexico or somewhere over there. So it's very different climate, very different climate.
Get that right, because you're
winter temperatures. I mean, he could easily see -30 Fahrenheit and may not break 0 degrees Fahrenheit for days at a time. So yeah, this is going to be it's a chilly spot. I'm just surprised he's been living in a tent through the winter. that is just, I don't know how he can handle that. That's just amazing.
I was introduced to air freezing index, which is a measurement I had not really been introduced for, but it is how you determine the footing depths as it relates to building. And, so most of the country is like, as I recall, 1,000, 1,500, 2,000. And then there's these little parts in northern New England and the northern Midwest that are, 2,500, 3,000, 3,500. And that is a big difference I have come to learn. It is way colder.
Yeah, the air freezing index in northeast Minnesota is 35 to 4,000. I checked that this morning, air freeze, which is, that your frost depth is probably down around 5 feet, I'm going to guess, or more. It gets cold for long periods of time.
That keeps out the riffraff. That's all I'm going to say about that. Well, I want to thank you all for listening. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks to Mike, Brian, and Andres for joining me, and thanks to all of you for being here listening. Please remember to send your comments, questions, and suggestions to FHBpodcast@finehomebuilding.com. And please like, comment, or review us however you're listening. It helps other folks find our podcast. Stay safe, everybody. Keep craft alive. Thank you very much for listening.